Good evening, everyone. If you could make your way to the seating area, we're going to get started with tonight's program. My name is Nazareth. I work here at the Africa Center as a lead in public programs. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this special program, How to Write About Africa, a tribute to the work of Binyavanga Wainaina. We're really excited to have all the speakers we have with us today. Mona Eltahawy, who was a good friend of Binyavanga's and can speak to his work and him as a person, and then Anderson Tepper, who's also written much about Wainaina and his legacy and all of his works. Uzo will be moderating tonight, and we're excited for this program. Thanks for coming. Please check out our Africa Day program on Saturday, which will be outside on our plaza to honor May 25th, World Africa Day. We'll have a DJ, music, vendors, art workshops, and it'll be a community event, so please join us. Please help me in welcoming Mona Eltahawy. Mona Eltahawy is a feminist author, commentator, and disruptor of the patriarchy. She is founder and editor-in-chief of the newsletter Feminist Giant. Next, we have Anderson Tepper. Anderson is a curator of international literature at City of Asylum in Pittsburgh. He writes regularly on books and authors for a variety of publications. His article on Wainaina, a provocative satirist, left in a pervasive legacy influencing African writing, appeared in the New York Times last May. And then our moderator for tonight, Uzodinma Iweala, is an award-winning writer, filmmaker, and medical doctor. As the CEO of the Africa Center, he is dedicated to promoting new narratives about Africa and its diaspora.
All right. Good evening, everyone. How are you all doing? I feel like, y'all should move a little bit closer. Because we don't bite. These seats in the front are not, they're not, you're not going to catch anything. So good evening. Just really, really excited to see all of you here for a discussion about an incredible, incredible writer, Binyavanga Wainaina. And I'm just so grateful to both of you, Mona and Anderson, for joining us. A couple of things just before we start our chat and our discussion. First of all, you're in the Africa Center. Follow us on all our socials at the Africa Center. Also, tomorrow we'll be opening, some of you have probably seen the exhibition that's hung, this exhibition tomorrow, which is called I Hope This Helps. So please, if it's not on your calendars, put it on your calendars. Come back tomorrow evening at 6. It's going to be fun. And this is really what we do here, which is about celebrating who we are as Africans, as diaspora people, the creative output that we have, and the thought-provoking discussions it inspires. And for tonight, we've got a really thought-provoking discussion about Binyavanga, who was a person without comparison. Let's just put it that way. So let me open with my first question to you, Mona, about your first impression of Binyavanga.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mona Eltahawy, as you heard. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I begin, as I begin everything, with my declaration of faith, which I know that Binge, as those of us who were honored enough to call him a friend, was known by. I think Binge would appreciate this declaration of faith. Fuck the patriarchy. Having said that, I first met Binge in 2015 at the World Voices Festival. And that was in May of 2015. And then a few months later, I was in Paris because my first book had just come out in French. The French translation of my first book had come out. And he was in Paris because he was teaching at NYU Paris. And he was with a group of writers, and my publicist at the time in Paris said, "Oh, you know all these writers, we should go meet them because they're probably going to go have dinner." So there was this reception for them because they were wrapping up. And another good friend of mine is the Bosnian author Sasha Hemon. So I went out with them to this restaurant in Paris. I forget what it's called now, but apparently it was a restaurant that Binge told us was much loved by Ernest Hemingway. I am not a fan of Ernest Hemingway, but
Not
for reasons,
surprised.
for
Not
reasons.
surprised.
Right, exactly. Which is why I appreciated this anecdote from Binge, because we were all sitting there, or like we were entering the restaurant to start with what was going to become a very fun and very drunken night of laughter and stories. And Binge said something like, you know, I was trying to explain to my mother once that Ernest Hemingway was a power bottom. And I was like, okay, it's going to be one of those evenings.
Midnight.
Exactly. So I have this wonderful picture of myself and Binge and Sasha. And it was such a lovely evening because that's what he is. Like you said, you know, he is someone that you do not forget. He was so warm. He was so loving. He was so funny. And we weren't, you know, incredible friends. I didn't know him from school or his time, you know, on the continent. But I so appreciated the times that we did meet. And our last meeting was in, I think it was either 2018 or 2019, when very soon after his stroke, when he was back at the World Voices Festival. And did he die in 2018 or was it 2019?
2019.
2019. So it was 2019 when he came to the festival, and so many of us gathered around him, and we were lucky to see him again,
Yeah.
you know, just before he died.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, just you would not forget when you, not at all, in no way. But Anderson, let me ask you, because you've interacted with Binyavanga through his work, and through your sort of your profile of his work and your criticism as well. And I'm interested in your first impressions, maybe from the page.
Yeah, so I didn't know him personally, but the first kind of impressions I had of him were in the early 2000s. He was just this kind of magnetic force. He was, I mean, I don't know if the word is meteoric rise, but he was in motion. 2002, he had won the Kane Prize, right? And he used that money, I believe, to start this magazine, Kwani.
Yep.
And so I heard about that, and I heard about the irreverence of it. I heard about, yeah, about his kind of this big persona of him before I even met him. And then, of course, 2005 is the Granta essay, How to Write About Africa. And then I was involved with the Penn World Voices Festival in 2015 when he came. And yeah, he had this big persona, but as this collection points out, people didn't know his work that well. I mean, there were only a few, I mean, the pieces would appear, regular pieces, but there was the one book, One Day I Will Write About This Place, his memoir. But I think people were waiting for more, and they were wondering, was he working on fiction? Was he working on a novel? And what this book does is it puts together a lot of those pieces, and you have a larger kind of picture of him as a writer and kind of the unfinished work that he left when he died young.
Yeah. So let me ask both of you. I'd be really interested in if you have a passage that you might want to read that sort of exemplifies what Binyavanga's writing really means to you, or what really stands out about him as an author.
Yeah, you know, when we were talking earlier about this, I mentioned that I would like to read from a piece that actually isn't in the book, but you were saying, Anderson, that it will be in a future collection, which I look forward to, which is, it was like a letter that he wrote to his mother after she died, telling her what he hadn't told her when she was alive, which is that he was gay. So I'm just going to read an excerpt from that. It was originally published in the online magazine, Africa is a Country. And then it was republished by the Guardian newspaper a few months after. So my headline is, I'm a homosexual mum. Okay, and it's the date is 11th of July, 2000. This is not the right version of events. Hey, Mum, I was putting my head on her shoulder that last afternoon before she died. She was lying on her hospital bed, Kenyatta, intensive care, critical care, there. Because this time I will not be away in South Africa, fucking things up in that chaotic way of mine. I will arrive on time and be there when she dies. My heart arrives on time. I'm holding my dying mother's hand. I'm lifting her hand. Her hand will be swollen with diabetes. Her organs are failing. Hey, Mum. Ooh, my mind sighs. My heart. I'm whispering in her ear. She is awake, listening, soft, calm, loving, with my head right inside in her birth space. She is so big, my mother in this world, near the next world, each breath slow, but steady as it should be. Inhale, she can carry everything. I will whisper louder in my mind's breath to hers. She will listen even if she doesn't hear. Can she? Mom, I will say. Mom, I will say. It grew so easy, a breath, a noise out of my mouth, mixed up with her breath, and she exhales. My heart gasps sharp, and now my mind screams, sharp, so hurt, so angry. I have never thrown my heart at you, Mum. You have never asked me to. Only my mind says this, not my mouth. But surely the jerk of my breath and heart there next to hers has been registered. Is she letting me in? Nobody ever in my life has heard this. Never, Mum. I did not trust you, Mum. And I pulled air hard and balled it down into my navel and let it out slow and firm, clean and without bumps, out of my mouth, loud and clear, over a shoulder into her ear. I am a homosexual, Mom. It will take me 5 years after my, go back another paragraph. I'm 29. It is 11th of July, 2000. I, Binyavanga Wainaina, quite honestly swear I have known I am a homosexual since I was 5. I have never touched a man sexually. I have slept with 3 women in my life. 1 woman successfully. Only once with her. It was amazing. But the next day I was not able to. It will take me 5 years after my mother's death to find a man who will give me a massage and some brief paid-for love in Earl's Court, London, and I will be freed and tell my best friend who will surprise me by understanding without understanding. I will tell him what I did, but not tell him I am gay. I cannot say the word gay until I'm 39, 4 years after that brief massage encounter. Today, it is 18th of January, 2013, and I am 43.
Thank you for that. Thank you. That was a beautiful reading as well. Anderson.
Yeah. So one thing that the editor of this book, Achal Prabhala, points out is Binyavanga wrote beautifully about Kenya, especially Nairobi, but he was also very much a Pan-African writer. And what I remember, an early encounter was before the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. He was doing a project on writing around the country. Were you involved?
I was involved in that
Tell me.
project. I got, it's kind of funny because my 2 brothers were in South Africa at the time. They got to go to all the World Cup games. Binyavanga sent me to Timbuktu.
There were no games.
There were no games there. Which, if you haven't been to Timbuktu, it's an amazing place to go, but not for 2 weeks. Let me just put it that way. But go ahead.
One of the pieces in this book is called The Most Authentic, Blackest Africanist Soccer Team. And I'll just read the ending. And it's about Togo in 2006, actually. The entire continent, almost every man and woman, all 900 million of us, from small towns in Germany to musty dormitories in Moscow, dusty and tired and drunk, living among abandoned warehouses and dead industries of New Jersey, in well-oiled boardrooms in Nairobi and Lagos and Johannesburg, in cramped tenements in the suburbs of Paris, inside the residences of the alumni of the Presidential School of Lomé, in the markets of Accra, and behind the corrugated iron bars of Lusaka, in school halls and social halls, in the giant markets of Addis Ababa, in ecstatic churches dancing in Uganda. This is all one sentence. On wailing coral balconies in Zanzibar, in a dark Roomba-belting, militia-ridden bar in Lubumbashi, in rickety video shops in Dakar, in prisons in the Central African Republic, in miniskirts on red-lit street corners in Cape Town, in super sports bars, in school halls, in Cherangani, in parliament cafeterias in Harare. We all jump up and down and shout and sing when in the 34th minute of the game, Mohamed Kadir gives Togo the lead over South Korea with a blistering shot from a very difficult angle. For 1.5 hours, the continent is a possible place.
Thank you. That's also a very beautiful reading. So, I mean, you picked two very different aspects of who Binyavanga was, and what his writing really gets at. So let's take them in turn, but then also move into some of the other areas that he writes about. And Mona, let's start, because you wrote about his coming out, and his queerness was such a part of his life. It's interesting that this collection doesn't focus on that, but some of the writing does sort of hint at that. So I'm interested in your thoughts about not just Binyavanga's writing about queerness, but also his shaping that space for discussion from an African context.
Yeah. You know, I want to start like even before that, because, you know, I'm here as an Egyptian. And one of the things that has been a growing concern of mine, as so many people before me have said, is this separation between Egypt and the continent. And much to my shame, so many prominent Egyptians in Egypt, including, you know, feminist heroes of mine, when they talk about the continent, they would say, you know, as they're writing from Egypt, I'm going to Africa. And I'm like, where the fuck do you think you are? How can you say that, you know? But it's a combination of racism, anti-Blackness, this obsession with Arabness that Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was so beloved among so many countries across the continent, especially those who were Pan-African, who were, you know, concerned and paid a great deal of attention to our post-colonial, you know, liberation heroes. You know, Nkrumah's children, well, Nkrumah's son married an Egyptian. An Egyptian woman went to Ghana to marry Nkrumah because she was so enamored of his, you know, post-colonial liberation struggle. So Egypt and its position on the continent has always been a great source of frustration for me. And because of that, and as a way to kind of push back against that, whenever I was invited to speak on the continent, I would go. So I've been to South Africa several times. I've been to Nigeria many times, and other countries across the continent. And all my visits to Nigeria were to a literary festival, an art and book festival called Ake, which was started by someone I know you know, Lola. And Lola, even though I never met Binj at Ake, his spirit was very much there, because the wonderful thing about Ake was that it became a magnet for queer Nigerians who knew that this was a place, you know, we say safe space now so lazily and so quickly, but Ake really was a safe space for young Nigerians and sometimes young Africans, because people came from other countries across the continent, to come and know that they would meet other queer Africans and that they would be accepted as the queer Africans that they were. So that's why I say that Binj's spirit was very much there, even if I didn't meet him in RK. And it was really important for me to read this particular essay because he wrote it at a time when there was all this anti-LGBTQ legislation popping up, mostly at the behest and the funding of white Christian nationalists from the United States, who knew that they were failing in this country. And so they took their money and they took their zealotry to Africa to do what they could no longer do in this country, although, you know, they're resurging in this country with all this fascist fuckery on the rise, you know, everywhere, but mostly in this country. So that essay that he wrote, I think, speaks to so many across the continent who, even if they weren't saying it out loud in the way that, and remember, he said, here I am at 43, finally saying it. And, you know, a few years later, he said that he was going to marry his boyfriend. And, you know, sadly, he died 5 years later. He, you know, he says, I ended with I'm 43, and he died when he was 48. So this is my kind of like, I'm trying to tie in many loose ends here by saying that what Binj represented, even if it took him so long to write that essay, is that we all knew he was gay. And among his friends, you know, we knew that he was gay. And his family, since his death, have said that they knew that he was gay and accepted his sexuality. But he represented this increasing boldness and increasing insistence on saying, we are here. And this frustration of mine of, you know, being an Egyptian who very much identifies as an African and straddle that fake continental divide between North Africa and the rest of the continent, I feel somewhat that I made that connection when I contributed an essay to an anthology that came out a couple of years ago called This Arab is Queer. Now, granted, it's that, that Arabness rather than the Africanness, but it was important for me to do what I think what Binge was doing for so many younger readers and people who follow our work, which is to say, and very much in the way that he said it, I also say in my essay, it's taken me years to say that I'm bisexual, to say that I'm queer, to say that I'm not monogamous, to say all of those things, which for someone in my position, someone in his position, born to an Egyptian family, born to a Muslim family of African descent. By the way, I've done my DNA profile with Ancestry.com, and I am 9% Ethiopian and 2% Senegalese.
Okay.
So I'm like, I'm African. Many other things as well, Nilotic people,
Right.
all of that. But this is a way of saying as well that all of these fake divides that have kept us apart, I think over the past, I would say decade or so, we have found each other.
Yeah.
And when I go to South Africa, like I was at Ubuntu just before lockdown locked us everywhere. I was in Ubuntu in Soweto in South Africa in December of 2019. And again, so many queer Africans there because we recognize each other and because we recognize the power of saying, I am here.
Right, right. I think you started off speaking about this idea of Pan-Africanness. And Anderson, I know you read that passage which ended with essentially a statement about that Pan-Africanness and, as is in some ways cliche football bringing us together, but a real explanation of that. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, what I also wanted to raise, let me think about that because, you might have a better perspective on the writing, but the journal that he created, Kwani, was a very Pan-African journal. And what I think is very important, what he did is he really led a movement of curation, self-curation, and self-creation of magazines, of publishing, editing, and mentoring, and creating a literary space for African writers that wasn't defined by what had come before and what were some of the other constraints and confined and preconceptions of what an African writer should be.
Right.
And we can also talk about his satirical, the way he was provocative, used humor, subversion to make his points.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah,
because there's a huge, whether it's from his essays or his fiction, but this idea of exactly that, of satire in Binyavanga's mind. So take us through your thoughts on satire, and then Mona, I'm interested also in your.
Yeah, no. We can talk about the Granta essay, How to Write About Africa, which made such a huge impression. And they say it's the biggest, the most read story of Granta online. It circulated around the world and made huge impact, right? And there's a great story behind the essay. I'm sure you know that it was originally a letter to the kind of an email to the editor saying your first Africa issue was full of crap. It was like every stereotype about Africa, and I guess he ranted and raved on a long email, and the editor said, "This is amazing. Can you work this and tighten it up and make this, and we'll publish it as it is."
And that's how this essay came about.
Yeah, and yeah, I remember the editor saying it kind of had all of his qualities were in that email, his humor, his passion, and all of that.
But I'm interested in your thoughts about that essay in particular.
Yeah, well, I was telling a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, she's an Egyptian poet called Marwa Hilal, who at one point used to teach at the New School. And I was telling her, I'm speaking at this event to honor Binyavanga. And she said that that essay inspired her to write her own essay, How to Write About Egypt. Because this is something obviously that we can just take how to write about. And those of us who are not white, cisgender heterosexual men can each of us write their own essay about what it means to write and speak and represent from, the various vantage points that we come from. And I haven't read Marwa's essay yet, How to Write About Egypt, but I have a fair guess of, what she would say. Because everything from the cover of books to the way that the countries are spoken about. His essay is spot on, you know, and that essay and all the other essays that were in the section on satire, I thought were so evocative of what binge represented in life. You know, that anecdote about Ernest Hemingway being a power bottom, you know, that's kind of like the kind of humor that, you know, he would just pull out and delight you with.
Yeah,
and I wish that
go ahead.
I wish that more I wish that as successful and as popular as that essay was, I wish that more people would read it, because we're still getting that drivel about Africa coming out, you know, and I know that binge was under no illusion that that would end once and for all, you know, the terrible stereotypes about Africa. But there are other parts in the book where he will talk about, you know, these white saviors coming from far away because, you know, people need help.
Right.
And, you know, I have to be here. And, you know, he talks about, you know, the ludicrous situations that so many African countries find themselves in, where so much money goes into bringing, you know, these essentially like white teenagers and you know, young white women in their early 20s coming to save African orphans and starving Africans, when, you know, the regime is in cahoots with NGOs and the money goes to all the wrong people. Right. So his satire is very well placed, but I wish that more people would read it so that they would be shamed into stopping what he was satirizing, you know?
Right, into thinking about it very differently. I just want to read a little bit, just the first sections of How to Write About Africa, so that folks who haven't read it just get a sense of how Binyavanga or Binge approached this. So this is from the opening of How to Write About Africa. How to Write About Africa. Always use the word Africa or darkness or safari in your title. Subtitles may include the words Zanzibar, Maasai, Zulu, Zambezi, Congo, Nile, Big Sky, Shadow, Drum, Sun, or Bygone. Also useful are words like gorillas, timeless, primordial, and tribal. Note that people means Africans who are not Black, while the people means Black Africans. Never have a picture of a well-adjusted African on the cover of your book or in it, unless that African has won the Nobel Prize. An AK-47, prominent ribs, naked breasts, use these. If you must include an African, make sure you get one in Maasai or Zulu or Dogon dress. In your text, treat Africa as if it were one country. It is hot and dusty with rolling grasslands and huge herds of animals and tall, thin people who are starving. Or it is hot and steamy with very short people who eat primates. Don't get bogged down with precise descriptions. Africa is big, 54 countries, 900 million people who are too busy starving and dying and warring and emigrating to read your book. The continent is full of deserts, jungles, highlands, savannas, and many other things. But your reader doesn't care about all of that. So keep your descriptions romantic, evocative, and unparticular. He is biting in his way, but I think you're right in that sense that there's so much of that just feels like what you read now. But I want to think about that within the context of his criticisms of Ryszard Kapuscinski, who he goes after in some of his essays in a major way, who, you know, I would say is a brilliant writer in many ways, but did succumb or subscribe to some of this way of rendering the continent. And I'm wondering how you think about this in terms of a conversation with that space in general, but in particular with an author like Kapuscinski.
You know, I never read him, but I remember when I was a young journalist, so I was a journalist in Egypt for, I don't know, 10, 15 years, maybe longer. And many of those years were spent with Reuters news agency, where I was basically trained to write about my country as a foreign correspondent. Right. So it was a really weird experience that I reflect on now. Like double consciousness, triple consciousness, call it whatever you want, you know, an Egyptian writing in English about Egypt as if she were a foreign correspondent in her own country. Right. And so many of the foreign correspondents who really were foreign to Egypt, you know, these white foreign correspondents coming from the US, Europe, the UK, because the Reuters back then was still a white boys club where the bureau chief was always some white man sent from London and all paid triple, 4 times whatever us locals were paid. And we are the ones who were really endangering our lives by writing about our regime as if we were foreigners, but we weren't, because we were the first ones dragged in as Egyptians to state security, and worse than dragged in. And they would always talk about this Polish guy. I'm like, who the fuck is this guy they're always talking about? And what is he writing about? So he became this kind of like goal of someone to aspire to. So when I read in this collection that, because I hadn't read Binge's pieces on him, I was like, finally, you know, because it became, this guy was like this holy grail of how to write about our countries. And I'm like, why? And there was a part of me that didn't want to read him because I just so resented that he would just keep coming up. And there was a part of me that was fascinated, but it was, I fell in that divide, you know, because I was that Egyptian trained to write about my own country as a foreigner.
Right.
So the last thing I wanted to do was make it worse by reading this guy, you know.
Right. Totally. Anderson.
Yeah, I haven't read much of Binyavanga on Kapuscinski, but I know there was a real backlash against Kapuscinski from a lot of points of view and perspectives. And yeah, that was tough. I mean, like you said, there was some great things about his writing, but he definitely bought into some of the stereotypes and encouraged them. Yeah, the book on Angola and Ethiopia.
Yeah.
But Uzo, can I ask you, as a writer, I mean, I'm a big fan of your novel Beasts of No Nation, and when you published that, what was it like for you entering this literary landscape of African writers? And I'm also thinking about now how it has changed. I think there's writers like Ivan Adiyambo Awor, who's one of my favorite writers, Dust and The Butterfly Sea, Emmanuel A. Dumas. It seems much more varied, much wider field, and thanks in a lot of ways to Binyavanga.
Yeah, I mean, I think his pushing, I think, is one of the things that definitely has widened. I mean, I think it is essays like How to Write About Africa that, while, as you were saying, Mona, don't completely change the landscape, do actually open up for sort of critical understanding on the part of, you know, folks who control publishing, right? And so it's not to say, but I think it's really important to note that like people have been writing varied understandings of the continent for so long. And what I've always said is that it's the multiplicity and the variety of stories that's important. No one story characterizes the United States or, you know, England or wherever. And yet somehow, some way, there was supposed to be that one story. You know, Chimamanda has talked about it.
Right.
You know, so many people have talked about it that characterized the continent. And I think I see my work as part of the multiplicity of stories and also part of a lineage of stories, right? So by far not the first person to have written about child soldiers. I mean, Binyavanga in his work mentions Amadou Koroma, for example. You know, there's Ken Saro-Wiwa. There's so many others who have written stories about conflict on the continent, just as there are many satirists, just as there are many, you know, from all perspectives. And I think what his pushing, and I think folks who subscribe to his way of thinking were able to do, is now create space for so many of those other stories. And if we think about the space now, you know, and I think it expands beyond just literature, but into all modes of creativity, the diversity, not just because of publishing in Western publications. Of course, the money is better there in so many cases, but because locally there is a real emphasis, and I don't want to use the word resurgence because I don't think resurgence is the right word. I just think there's an emphasis is maybe better on those spaces for people to communicate their artistic endeavors or artistic ideas, and that I think is really, really important. And again, things like Kwani were 100% part of that. So, you know, for me, for example, it was Binyavanga's work with Kwani that sent us around to different places on the continent during the World Cup. And that's something that I don't know you would have gotten done in any other publication except for that. This wild, crazy idea that we're just going to put people in all these different places while the biggest event in football history is happening. I mean, it takes a crazy person to make that happen. And he was that crazy person. Yeah.
And there were more magazines that came out of that, right? Mona, we were talking about Remy's in Namibia, right? And yeah, other kind of
are so many online magazines that have come that have been started over the past few years, where so much literary talent has been coming out of the continent. And I think because I saw your review of Binge's book in the Times, and you spoke to so many of the authors that have been to RK, who themselves have been part of that emergence of so many new names on the continent. And many of them found first places to be published these online magazines. And one of the things I love the most about these online magazines, I wasn't familiar with Kwani, but many of the more recent online magazines, is that they take a really proudly, what in the past, there wasn't even room to call it parochial, and I don't think parochial is the right word, but something really local, where they say, we are Africans writing about Africa, depending on the various countries that they come from, and we don't really care who reads it outside of the continent, because there are enough of us who are reading it, and we love this, and we don't need, like for lack of a better term, or to summarize it, the white gaze to bless us with, this is literary fiction, or this is literary nonfiction, because we are enough, and there are enough of us to do this. Now, RK grew into the biggest arts festival on the continent, but there are so many other arts and book festivals that have been around and that have come to be since. And so I think it's what I love the most is this confidence, this insistence that these are our voices and these are our platforms, and we don't have to. And this is coming from someone who, for the longest time, all my work was published in these so-called Western publications. So I was the Reuters correspondent in Cairo and in Jerusalem. I was a stringer for the Guardian newspaper. So many of my bylines have been in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And for the longest time, those were the places that you would point to and say, I've written dozens of opinion pieces for the New York Times, and now I don't give a flying fuck. I'm like, fuck the New York Times. I don't ever want to publish there again, because there is a very specific way to be published in those publications. I have my own newsletter now. In a way, I'm doing what all of these authors have been doing through their online publications, saying, I don't really care who reads my newsletter, and I don't really care. Well, I often do, because I do need to pay my rent, where the money comes from. But, but for now, it is there as a platform for me to be confident in my own way, in my own space, And I'm 56, and it took me a while to get there. But in my early 20s, these places didn't exist. So I'm really excited for younger Africans who have those places that exist now, so that they don't have to wait until their 50s to say, I don't need the white gaze and the New York Times.
To do that. Anderson.
No, I was just going to say, in the book, it tells the story about his piece that won the Kane Prize in 2002 was published online. He was contributing to an online publication, and at first they didn't accept it for the Kane Prize, and he argued for it, and it was accepted, even though it was published online, and it won. And that, yeah.
Right. I'm interested if you have from the collection, if you each have a favorite piece from this collection.
I actually love the piece that you mentioned that won the Kane Prize. You might be your favorite too. Discovering Home.
Discovering Home.
Yeah. Because, I come from a large family. My mom is one of 11 and my dad is one of 8. And he writes about going to Uganda for his, I think it was his grandparents', was it 60th or 50th wedding anniversary? So he's got relatives coming in from all over the place, including one aunt who finally kind of at the last minute makes it from New York City. And it's Christmas too, or it's close to Christmas. But it's this long kind of like meandering piece. That is the piece that won the Kane Prize, right? Discovering Home.
Yeah.
But he takes the time to write about all the places along the way that he goes and stops at, and the people he talks to. And he writes it in a way that offers no explanation about, more recently with writers like Junot Diaz and others here in the United States, they started saying things like, I will no longer translate Spanish words in my writing because I am Dominican, I'm Latinx, whatever their ethnic background is. And I'm proud of being Spanish, and I'm proud of being bilingual, trilingual, whatever it is. And if you don't understand it, just get it from the context. And that's what I got from this piece, you know, that Binge is writing about as a Kenyan man whose mother is Ugandan, and his family is going to Uganda. And along the way, he meets all of these different people and goes to all these different places with no need to interpret what he's seeing or what he's doing or what they're saying to him. But you get it, of course, from the context.
Right.
And he writes so beautifully and moving about his family and what it means to him to be there and how long it took for him, especially because he was in South Africa and he took some time to go and spend, I think, a year back in Kenya. So for me, as an Egyptian, it evoked all of that, the connections. And I really appreciated that when he wrote this piece, he fought for it to be included, as Anderson was saying, in the Kane Prize, and it eventually went on to win, which was a real, validation of everything he represents.
Totally.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, you know, what's interesting about this collection is the range of what he's writing. I mean, people knew him for the memoir and for the satirical essay, but there's short stories in here. He was writing fiction. He's writing travel pieces. He's writing essays, memoir. And what probably a lot of people might not know is that he was writing food criticism,
Right,
food writing.
right.
For a while, he was in South Africa. He ran a restaurant, I think. He ran a catering service. I mean, he had a whole other persona in life.
Right.
That's
right.
really interesting.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the food because
You mentioned that, 'cause I love the recipes.
right.
Yeah,
I
there's
mean,
actual recipes in here.
what's interesting about that writing, right, is that one is it's both ode to, critique of, and also recipes, right? And I mean, in a sense, it defies form, right? In a way where it's like it's not your traditional food critics piece. It's not a cookbook. It's I'm going to write the way that I want to write.
It's
Which
very
is still-
characteristically him, his voice, right?
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. All right. So, what's your favorite dish then, Mona?
You know, it's interesting you should say that because at first I was like, this is going to be too complicated for me to cook. And where am I going to find these ingredients? But then I would slow down and I'd be like, my God, this tastes so delicious. This sounds so delicious. And I'm like, I'm making notes now. You know, I got to go and get this. And if I don't find something, I'll just make do. But he writes about food with such delight, you know. And I think two of the things that surprised me the most as like reading everything back to back was the way that he writes about food and the way that he writes about women.
Mhm.
Because so often he would take the time to talk about, you know, this particular woman that he met or women from this particular background. And oh my God, these women, if they look at you, you know, unlike sissy women, if these women in this particular place look at you, you know, you're done for. And he really stopped and appreciated and gave space to writing about women in a way that honestly I was not expecting. And so I really appreciate that. Food and women.
Food and women is the
Yeah, another thing that's interesting is the book covers his writing in South Africa, when he moved to South Africa, when he moved back home to Kenya, but also when he lived in England and the US. He spent a lot of his, I think, the last years or so at Bard College, right? He was head of the Chinua Achebe Center at Bard. So he had a lot of time spent here in the US.
right as
Yeah.
well. As well. I mean, the South Africa time is very interesting. And I think it goes back to some of your initial thoughts about the Pan-Africanness of his work, and that not just the Pan-Africanness, but the multiplicity of perspectives. I mean,
Yeah.
he is in his very being sort of a Pan-African, right? A mother from Uganda,
Yeah.
raised in Kenya, lived or came of age, shall we say, in South Africa.
During the
And
90s, a really important time.
at a
Yeah,
really,
crazy,
really definitive
crucial,
time
yeah.
for the country, South Africa, and then
And
of
I
course
think
the
in Cape
continent.
Town, in a very interesting area. of
Right.
Cape Town, yeah.
So, you know, this again, I think it goes back to this idea of being able to write a piece like how you write about Africa,
Yeah.
or how to write about Africa because of having seen so much of Africa and bringing that into his work. Right.
I think, you know, that there's a section of his columns from the South African, was it the Mail and Guardian? I think they gave him a weekly column or something. And one of them is about the songs that were made by Western artists for the famine in Ethiopia. And the way that he writes about We Are the World is just incredible. It's so funny. And, you know, it's part of that satire. It wasn't in the satire section. It's in the section that puts together his columns from South Africa, but he really skewers them, you know? Everyone from Bob Geldof, who wasn't on We Are the World, he was on the other really awful one. Oh my God, Do They Know It's Christmas? Fuck, all of those songs, you know, again, oh my God, we must do something,
Right.
and, you know, and so seeing them all together like that, I had not read his columns in the Mail and Guardian, but that one especially, just it was such a breath of like biting air that he will not let you get away with things like that.
Right, right.
Do you know more about, I mean, I've understand that Kwani, when he's formed it in Nairobi, was very much a cultural center of Nairobi with events and, you know, readings, kind of like this, a cultural center.
Right. I am not it's one of the regrets is not having been able to, but just the ethos, I think, and the vibe was one that I think he took with him wherever he went in terms of sort of generating that sense of community and then of course debate and discussion. So I think this goes back to the bitingness of his work, whether satirical or not, the incisiveness, I think, is such an important aspect of the way that he wrote. Yeah. Okay, so let's do this. I think we'll turn, and perhaps if there are questions from the audience for our panelists, we can do that, and then I'm going to come back to you all for your sort of final thoughts about Binyavanga, how to write about Africa and his work. So I'll open it up, and there's a mic that will be going around. And don't be shy, but I will ask you to ask a question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Tosin. I haven't had the time or chance to read the book yet, but I know I definitely want to read it afterwards. But listening to you three speak, something that has been coming to mind is, what do you think upcoming African writers, I want to say writing in a broad sense, but well, I'm an architect, but in my mind, I think that designing, for me, drawing is a style of writing. That's how I interpret it. So what do you think that upcoming African writers are up against, I guess, in the future? And how do you think that we can challenge, I guess, some dominant narratives in the continent?
And I'd be interested from both of your perspectives. So Mona, maybe you start first, and then Anderson, I'd be interested in hearing this.
Okay. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your question. I can tell you from all the literary festivals that I've mentioned I've been to, a question that comes up every time and at several panels is, who do we write for? And writing in the diaspora versus writing on the continent. And where do we publish? So do you need to publish in the New York Times? Do you need the New York Times to review your book? Why are you writing in English? Why are you writing from New York City? Why aren't you writing from, you know, X, Y, and Z? So I think those questions will always be there. And I think we need to not ignore them so much, but I think that we need to put them in a place where we're aware that those questions exist, but to write anyway, to anticipate those questions coming. To my mic. Oh, there we go. For me, it so often comes up, you know, why are you saying this in English? Why aren't you saying this in Arabic? I could go on and on about the fact that my parents took me out of Cairo when I was 7. And so English became my first language at the age of 7. So ask my parents why I don't write in Arabic. I'm fluent in Arabic, but and much more comfortable writing in English. But does it diminish my writing because I write in English? You know, enough people that I want to read my work read me in English. So why does it diminish my writing as an Egyptian or as an African to write in English? But these are the questions that will come up again and again, you know? And sometimes I really think they're disingenuous questions. I really don't think that people who bring them up are interested in engaging with the work. And so I'm delighted that Binge wrote in English because I can read it, you know? I don't know if he wrote in any other languages, but I'm so glad he wrote in English, because I can read it and so many other people can read it. And I feel the same way about my work. So if I were to summarize what I just said, I think the best way to write is to write from the place where you stand, knowing who you are and not waiting for anyone else to give you an identity. You create your own identity and write from there. Others will try to either question that identity or demand that you assume other identities, but write from where you stand.
And Anderson.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing from my perspective, what I know is the publishing world, and I would say that the example of Binyavanga is this kind of do-it-yourself, DIY, independence. And today in publishing, I think there's a whole bunch of smaller independent publishers who are taking risks and who are open to a plethora of different voices and different perspectives.
Other questions? Okay, so we've got two, so we'll do here and then.
Hi. Oh, God. Okay, it works. Yeah, so can I just speak? Can everyone hear me?
I think because we've got it, we've got folks online, so you might need.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I didn't know about this author before, and I can't wait actually to read him. And I now understand that the title, How to Write About Africa, was somewhat facetious. But I was curious, one, how do you think if you asked him in earnest how to write about Africa, what do you think his answer would have been? And what are your own, just personally? And I realize that there's a multiplicity of answers, but
That's a good
personal
one.
side.
So how do you think, I mean, let's start there. How do you think that he would have?
Well, I mean, he did. I mean,
Yeah,
he did.
the memoir,
This is what the
right?
book, yeah.
Yeah,
and
and
this
the
book
memoir,
too,
yeah.
right? So, I mean, I haven't read the memoir, but if you read this book that we're here to discuss tonight, you will see that he wrote about, hello? Hi. This book that we're discussing tonight, he does write about Africa. So I think if you're asking how would he have written about Africa, if you read this book, you will see how he's written about Africa in a very genuine and loving way,
Yeah.
that he wished others afforded the various parts of the continent did.
And Anderson?
Yeah, and I really recommend the memoir. One day I will write about this place. It's beautifully written. His language is rich. It's original. It pops off the page. And I think he would say, yeah, you write from your real experiences. You write honestly. You write with humor, pathos. You write with, all those different levels.
And he doesn't write in an uncritical way. I don't think it was ever his intention by writing that satirical essay to say you can only write good things about Africa. You can only talk about it in a glowing, praising way. That I don't think that was his goal ever. It is that genuine. In many places, he's very critical of various people and places across the continent that he encounters. So it's not this kind of like, everything is fantastic, nothing is wrong. That I don't think that was never Binge. And I don't think that was ever what he wanted. What he didn't want was, all these tropes and stereotypes, like, every book cover about the continent. And this is, many people have written about this, is, like the sun over a tree top somewhere, I had a farm in Africa, that kind of thing. That's what he's writing about.
I would just add that I knew about the how to write about Africa, but I didn't know about the other satirical essays. There's one called How to Be a Dictator,
Which is
How to Be an African. So he kind of got on a roll, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Mubarak got a mention in there, so I was like, yeah.
Here, I'll give this to you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if this is more of a question or a comment, but more going back into what you talk about publishing and stories. Although we're not talking about him right now, but I had a flashback to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who was also from Kenya and who talked about decolonizing the mind. He wrote some of his novels in English and then went towards more Kikuyu, his ancestral language. And although I respect it in theory, being African myself, I always wonder if that was very realistic in the sense that like there's 54 nations on the African continent, won't be able to read or understand everyone's national language or local language. So I think it makes sense in a practical way when we write either English, French, or like Portuguese when it comes to the former colonies. And is it really a bad thing to continue to be published or recognized by international publishing houses or Westerners? Because the goal is to make sure that stories are not continuously offensive or rigid when it comes to like African storytelling.
I'm glad you brought that up because the other thing that comes up as well, you know, and why don't you write in Arabic? Is like, why are you writing and speaking in the colonizer's language, you know? And my response is that I have learned the colonizer's language so well that I can use it against them, you know? And I think the people sometimes forget that. So, you know, you mentioned English, French, Portuguese. These are the languages and the legacies of the colonizers of our continent. But we are so fluent in them now. I can tell you, when we moved to London when I was 7 years old, I grew up to become the girl who was the best in English class. I was much better in English than all the white girls in my class. So we have learned the colonizers' language so well that we can use it against them and use it better than they can. So I think that that is something that we shouldn't be ashamed of and we shouldn't shy away from. But I think you make also a really important point about how do we address each other. I think I've learned a lot from my Indian friends about this, because there are dozens and dozens of languages spoken across India. And the way for many people there to understand each other is, again, to use the language of the colonizer. So many Indians will speak to each other in English. As an Egyptian, now, when it comes to Arabic, I can tell you that when I go to Tunisia and Morocco, I am lost. I am fucked. I have no idea what they're saying, because they speak an indigenous language, Amazigh, that is often mixed with French and Spanish, depending on where in the country you are. And so unless they speak to me in classical Arabic, we have to speak to each other in English. So language is this like pliable, like plasticine that we can use in the way like Play-Doh, the Americans would say, you know. We can use language and use it to our strength. So I think it is important to publish in those languages. As for the foreign publishing houses, I think the advantage that they will bring is that they have, in many cases, an international audience, and they have money. But there are many publishing houses that are coming out of the continent now that are growing, you know, like Cassava Republic. Lola has her own publishing house in Nigeria. There are many publishing houses there are several in South Africa, the names of which unfortunately I've forgotten. But, you know, they are also coming up in a much more confident way as a way for authors on the continent to publish. And sometimes books are picked up from those publishers on the continent by others who can take the books to an international audience.
Interesting. Yeah. So what I think we'll do is I'll come back to you as we close up with the one or two things that you would want people to take away about Binyavanga and his impact on African writing, but really on global literature. Anderson, we'll start with you.
Oh, good. I'll have to think about that. But the one thought that was in my mind was the question, during his lifetime, did his outsized personality kind of overshadow in some ways his work? That was a question I was thinking about writing about this book, that this book gave a really, gave a better sense of the breadth of his work. But I do remember during his lifetime, he was combative, he was, you know, confrontational, he was outspoken, certainly controversial in some ways, but that was the thought that was in my mind. But let me think about the bigger issues also.
Okay. And Mona?
You know, I think often about the fact that Binge died when he was only 48.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm 56. And, you know, we all think about our impending mortality. And I think that for someone so young, because 48 is young, he has left such a wonderful legacy, so many things for us to read, so many things to challenge and inspire. And there are, every now and then on social media, someone will come on and say, I published my first book when I was 60. It's never too late to do anything. And of course it's not, you know, but it's a reminder to disengage from this obsession about, you know, you have to have done this by this age and you have to have done this by that age. And no, just do it whenever you did it. But foremost, above everything, live, you know, live fully. I think if anyone asked me to describe Binge in like one sentence, it is that he lived and he lived fully. So if we can be inspired to do that, just go out there and live. And I think that would be the best way to honor Binge's legacy.
To that end, I remember one of the last times I saw Binge was at a TEDx event in London, where he told a story but came on stage in a bright pink dress. And if that is not living fully, I do not know what is.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that his legacy really is that he wore many hats, that he was this one person who was a writer, editor, publisher, magazine creator, and movement galvanizer. He was a real connector of people, and an activist. All these different sides to him.
So with that, I think we will say our thanks to Binyavanga Wainaina for gracing our world with his incredible writing. Yes, we can clap. We should clap. Because I mean, I can truly say that without the way that he's shaped this discussion, I don't think that space for so many writers would be there. And so for that, I'm exceedingly grateful. And to Anderson, to Mona, I'm really grateful for you all being here, discussing his work and really sharing your insights, not just on him, but also on the wider world that he's helped to shape. So thank you both very much.
Thank you, Uzo. Thank
you. And wait, sorry. Oh no, 1 second. So to all of you really quickly, so we have books in the back for sale. If you want to take one of these amazing copies home with you. And I would urge you, do get this book. Do spend a lot of time with this book because it will change your life in many, many ways. So thank you all for being here, for coming to the Africa Center. And like I said, we hope to see you here in the future, also tomorrow for the opening. So all right, take care, y'all, and have a good night.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us, the stories that shape us, and the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us, the ones that hold us down, the ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.